Attempting to land a passenger jet on the open sea, far from the safety of land, is something very few airline crews have ever faced. Such a situation would mean confronting towering waves, slow rescue times, the possibility of predators in the water, and dangerously cold temperatures. Even if the landing itself went well, surviving afterward would be uncertain at best. And yet, this exact scenario has played out on rare occasions. One of the most notable incidents happened in the spring of 1970, involving a little-known U.S. charter carrier called Overseas National Airways, or ONA. ONA mostly operated under military contracts, charter services, and lease deals with other airlines. At the time, their fleet included Douglas DC-8 South, DC-9S, and several Lockheed Electras. In 1969, the company was approached with a lease proposal from ALM Antillean Airlines, a subsidiary of KLM, and the national airline of the Netherlands, and ALM's network connected several Caribbean islands, Aruba, Curaçao, and St. Martin among them, but they wanted to expand service with a direct route from St. Martin to New York City, because their own fleet lacked the right aircraft for the job. They turned to ONA. St. Martin, a small island east of Puerto Rico, is divided almost evenly between French and Dutch territories. Its airport, Princess Juliana International, is famous today for jet blast videos on Maho Beach. But back in 1970, it had a much shorter runway of just 5,249 feet, surrounded by water on both ends. That runway was too short for ONA's larger DC-8 South, but their CEO argued that the smaller DC-9 South could manage the operation. The DC-9 could land easily on St. Martin's short runway, but range was the real challenge. Most versions of the DC-9 couldn't fly non-stop between New York and St. Martin unless very lightly loaded. The only model in ONA's fleet capable of the trip with a full passenger load was their single DC-9-33, which had just enough range to meet the required standards. So, a deal was struck. The flights would operate under what is known as a damp lease. ONA supplied the aircraft and flight deck crew, while AMH handled ticket sales and staffed the cabin. From the very beginning, though, problems emerged. In 1970, there were no modern ETOPS rules for long overwater twin-engine flights. Regulations at the time required that two-engine aircraft remain within 1 hour of a diversion airport in case of an engine failure. On the New York-St. Martin route, there was a small stretch of ocean where no alternate airport was within that 1-hour window. Because of this, the FAA initially refused to approve the nonstop service. Their suggested workaround was to reroute flights through the Bahamas, keeping the plane closer to land. But that detour would have added extra distance, required a fuel stop, and wiped out any profits, something ONA couldn't afford since they were already struggling financially. Just days before the first scheduled flight, ONA received a lifeline. McDonnell Douglas introduced a new single-engine descent procedure that slightly extended the allowable 1-hour diversion radius enough to cover the gap on the direct route. With this new data in hand, the FAA finally signed off on the flights. Still, approval didn't mean smooth sailing. The DC-9-33 could only complete the journey nonstop if weather and air traffic conditions were perfect. If headwinds or delays arose, the contract required a refueling stop in Bermuda before continuing to New York. And so, with all these complications and risks, the service between St. Martin and New York began. The plan for these flights was unusual. Departures from New York would generally follow a path toward Bermuda. Once near the island, the crew would check whether enough fuel remained to continue directly to St. Martin with the legally required reserves. If the numbers worked, they would skip the stop and head straight to the destination. If not, they would land in Bermuda to refuel before continuing south. Despite this complicated setup, the non-stop route between New York and St. Martin launched on schedule in January 1970, but not long afterward. The FAA once again threatened to halt the operation, this time over something as simple as seating in the cockpit. In the early years of long-range flying, navigators were employed to calculate positions while aircraft crossed areas without radio beacons. By 1970, most airlines had already phased out navigators, thanks to modern equipment. But ONA still had an active labor contract with the Navigators Union. That ran through 1971. That agreement stated that any flight operating beyond the reach of ground-based navigation aids had to carry a navigator. On the New York-St. Martin route, there was a brief stretch that met those conditions, which meant ONA was contractually obligated to place one on board. The problem was that ONA's DC-9 had a cockpit designed for only 2 pilots. The navigator had no workstation and was forced to occupy the cramped, fold-down jump seat for the 3.5-hour flight each way. The company had equipped the aircraft with brand new Lorenzi navigation gear, which made the navigator's role essentially redundant. But rules were rules, and the extra crew member still had to be present. Not long after the service began, an FAA inspector boarded a flight for a routine check. Since the jump seat was already taken by the navigator, the pilots told the inspector to sit in the passenger cabin instead. That defeated the whole purpose of the check. and the FAA immediately warned ONA that the route would be grounded unless a solution was found. ONA scrambled to negotiate with the union and eventually reached an agreement. When inspectors were scheduled to fly, they would be given priority for the jump seat. Although it sounds almost humorous now, this situation created serious operational headaches for ONA, and, as events would prove, it wasn't the last clash they'd have with regulators. Another problem surfaced in April 1970. During one of the flights to St. Martin, while an FAA inspector happened to be on board, the jet landed with less fuel than the regulations required. This was a serious issue, and to understand why, it helps to know how fuel planning worked at the time. Every flight was required to carry not only enough fuel to taxi, take off, and reach the destination, but also additional reserves, enough to attempt a missed approach, enough to divert to the farthest designated alternate airport, enough to hold at 1,500 feet for 30 minutes, called the final reserve, plus a contingency equal to 10% of the trip fuel. The expectation was that, even after all of this, the aircraft would still land at its destination with at least the 30-minute holding reserve remaining in the tanks. For every flight, regulations required enough fuel, not just to complete the journey to the destination, but also to cover a missed approach, a diversion to an alternate airport, at least 30 minutes of holding at 1,500 feet, and a 10% contingency reserve. In other words, the aircraft was supposed to touch down with the alternate and final reserve fuel still available in the tanks. If calculations and routes showed that the aircraft would land with less than that amount, the crew was expected to divert unless they were virtually certain of landing safely at the planned destination. In April 1970, during one flight to St. Martin, ONA jet touched down with only 3,400 pounds of fuel, left far short of the required reserve plus alternate. The FAA investigated the incident and responded by creating stricter rules specifically for ONA's New York St. Martin service. Their new directive required that every flight arrive with at least 7,000 pounds remaining. The notice was officially distributed to all ONA staff on May 1, 1970. Just one day before the flight, at the heart of this story, on May 2nd, an ONA crew arrived at New York's JFK Airport to operate the service southward. The captain was 37 years old, a highly experienced aviator with 12,000 total hours, 1,700 of those on the DC-9. His personal reputation was complicated. A former Air Force pilot and friend of ONA's CEO, he had been handpicked in 1967 to serve as chief pilot for the DC-9 fleet. Known as a traditional hands-on flyer, he disliked using the autopilot, preferring to handle the controls himself. He was also notorious for being a tough instructor, proudly calling himself the cherub-faced assassin. Because of how many trainees he failed, but his career had been blemished. Only months after becoming chief pilot, he was forced to resign when allegations surfaced that he had taken trainee police officers on a joyride during a training flight, and possibly even allowed a civilian passenger into the right-hand seat. Although removed from his management role, he stayed on as a line pilot and instructor. Ironically, one of the students he had once judged too weak to pass was now his assigned first officer for this very flight. That first officer had about 3,500 hours in total, including 600 on the DC-9, but his training experience had left him shaken. He lacked confidence, had requested extra observation time before line duty, and felt unprepared for international flying. He even protested being placed on the May 2nd roster, citing inexperience with both St. Martin procedures and the Lorenzi navigation system. But his objections were overruled, and he reported for duty at JFK. The third flight deck member was the required navigator. Though experienced, he had no specific DC-9 training and no real responsibilities other than occupying the jump seat to satisfy contractual obligations. Alongside them were 3 ALM flight attendants to work in the front cabin and 1 at the rear plus 57 passengers, for a total of 63 people on board. Fuel planning that day was shaped by the new FAA bulletin and an added complication. ONA's DC-9 South had been fitted with JATO jet-assisted takeoff hardware for cargo operations, which created extra drag and raised fuel burn by as much as 10%. Accounting for that, the captain calculated they would need 28,000 pounds, including reserves. With no weight limitations, he ordered the tanks filled to 28,900 pounds. On paper, this was more than adequate. Weather forecasts called for scattered to numerous showers and thunderstorms across the region, with some areas of low ceilings and poor visibility, but conditions were not considered especially unusual for that season. Confident, the captain pressed forward with the plan. There was one minor issue. The cockpit microphone for the passenger address system wasn't working. Since it wasn't considered essential equipment, it was logged and left for later, repair, a detail that would take on serious importance later in the flight. At 11:02, the DC-9 pushed back from JFK as AM Antillean Airlines Flight 980. The captain was the pilot flying. The first officer handled monitoring duties. Departure was smooth, and they climbed into clear skies. The captain planned to cruise at 29,000 feet at Mach 0.78 for the first half of the flight, then switched to a long-range cruise setting to conserve fuel. Jets are far more efficient at higher altitudes, so this was a sensible plan. Initially, fuel burn matched expectations. Passing abeam Bermuda, the crew checked their numbers and decided they had enough margin to continue directly to St. Martin without stopping for fuel. But as they pressed southward, thunderstorms grew along the route. To avoid turbulence, the captain descended first to 27,000 feet, then later to 25,000 feet, also slowing down in hopes of smoother conditions. These changes increased fuel consumption beyond the original estimates, and their arrival time slipped from 14:42 to 15 o'clock. By then, the captain calculated they would touch down with about 6,000 pounds, remaining nearly all of the contingency fuel gone. Still, this was within the purpose of carrying contingency in the first place. Approaching the Guava intersection, 211 miles north of St. Martin, the crew contacted San Juan Center and were cleared down to 10,000 feet. But San Juan also delivered troubling news. Weather at Princess Juliana Airport had dropped below minimums for the approach. Back then, St. Martin's runway lacked an instrument landing system, just as it still does today, because it extended over water at both ends. The only instrument procedure was a non-directional beacon (NDB) approach, requiring a complex course reversal and descent to 600 feet, with a minimum of 2 miles of visibility. If the runway wasn't in sight at the missed approach point, a go-around was mandatory. Hearing that conditions were below these limits, the captain initially chose to divert to San Juan to wait for improvements. But when he later contacted the tower at Princess Juliana directly, they reported that the situation had improved slightly. A broken cloud base at 1,000 feet and 4 to 5 miles of visibility, though in steady rain. After struggling to copy the message over a poor HF radio link, the crew concluded that conditions might be good enough for a safe landing attempt. The captain requested clearance back toward St. Martin and turned the jet around. The key question at this point was whether it was still wise to head back toward St. Martin, attempt a landing, and if unsuccessful, continue on to the alternate field at St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. By now, the fuel gauges showed only 5,800 pounds remaining. A diversion to St. Thomas would take around 2,100 pounds, and regulations required that they arrive with no less than 4,300 pounds, the diversion fuel plus final reserve. If projections fell below that figure, Persetta dictated that the safer move was to abandon St. Martin altogether and head directly for the alternate. There was a troubling detail. The captain of this very flight had been at the controls just weeks earlier, when another ONA jet landed in St. Martin with fuel well below minimums, prompting an FAA investigation. And once again, the same personality dynamics were in play. The first officer, lacking confidence and experience, was hesitant to challenge authority. The navigator, meanwhile, wasn't even present in the cockpit. That left no one in a position to question the captain's judgment. Confident in his own assessment, the captain pressed on. His calculations suggested that if they were cleared for a straightforward arrival, they'd touch down at 15:05 with about 4,400 pounds of fuel left barely above the minimum requirement. But that estimate depended on an ideal, direct routing. In reality, controllers issued delaying vectors for traffic, keeping the jet down at just 2,500 feet. That cost them an additional 800 pounds of fuel and pushed their approach clearance back until 10 minutes after the captain had expected to be on the ground. At that stage, the prudent choice would have been to divert, since the numbers no longer worked. When fuel is tight, pilots are trained to proceed to the destination only if the weather clearly guarantees a landing. Here, success was uncertain, and any missed approach would leave them with only a razor-thin margin to reach St. Thomas. Yet the captain chose to continue, falling into what aviators call get-there-itis, a mindset where the desire to complete the flight overrides cautious decision-making. From his perspective, the weather was above published minimums, a landing seemed likely, and a successful arrival would simplify everything. But this kind of thinking narrows options and blinds crews to the growing risks. Modern threat and error management strategies teach pilots to anticipate such scenarios by setting fuel decision gates, predefining how many approach attempts are acceptable, and ensuring that the pilot monitoring actively challenges risky thinking. Unfortunately, none of that structure was present here. The first officer offered little resistance, and no structured threat analysis was carried out. What the crew also didn't realize was that the weather report they received didn't truly represent conditions on the final approach. The tower's observations gave a broken ceiling at 1,000 feet and 2 to 3 miles of visibility. But that was measured toward the hills east of the field. The approach path came from the west, over open water, where no visual references existed. In fact, witnesses near the shoreline later reported that a heavy rain shower sat directly off the runway threshold, cutting visibility to as little as a half-mile or even a quarter. Unaware of this, the crew crossed the NDB and began the outbound leg of the published approach. Descending to 600 feet, they configured the aircraft with flaps 25, landing gear down, and reduced speed to about 140 knots. Turning inbound, the captain guided the jet through the rain. And when the runway finally appeared, he realized they had overshot too far left to align. Fuel now read about 3,800 pounds. That was still just enough to execute a missed approach and continue to St. Thomas, but the option wasn't even discussed. Instead, the captain convinced himself that the approach would have worked if he had simply kept the runway in sight earlier, so he chose to circle tightly at 600 feet, hoping to remain visual and line up correctly on a second attempt. Technically, air traffic control had given him freedom to maneuver as he saw fit. But this was not a briefed or standard procedure, and it carried obvious risks. He rolled the jet into a tight left-hand circuit northwest of the airport, but again the rain obscured the field, and once more he came out misaligned, too far to the left. Today, most airlines impose strict rules, rarely more than 2 approaches at the same airport, and a third only if success is virtually assured. Those policies exist because of incidents like this one. Nevertheless, the captain decided to try a third time. This time, he planned to extend the flaps fully and slow the jet to about 130 knots, reducing the turning radius in hopes of squeezing the airplane onto final. Attempting a second tight left-hand circuit with the aircraft already fully configured for landing created tremendous drag, which naturally drove up fuel burn, but no one in the cockpit openly discussed this. The first officer contributed little more than silence, and whatever thoughts the navigator had were never recorded. So, without challenge, the captain pressed on with the maneuver. This time, he managed to keep the runway in view throughout the turn. The problem, however, was distance. By circling so close to the threshold, there simply wasn't enough room to descend from 600 feet to the runway in a stable manner. He briefly tried to force the descent, but quickly abandoned the idea when it became obvious that the rate required would cause the aircraft to pick up too much speed and risk overshooting the pavement. At last, he broke off, initiating a missed approach's third failed attempt in just 11 minutes. At that stage, calculations suggested around 2,200 pounds of fuel remained barely above the 2,100 pounds needed for a diversion to St. Thomas under ideal conditions, but that margin depended on climbing quickly to an efficient altitude and maintaining optimal power settings. Any deviation, any extra drag, or unexpected routing would push them below the safety line. In other words, they had now crossed into a true fuel emergency, even though the crew never formally declared one. After abandoning the approach, the captain radioed Juliana Tower, requesting clearance to divert. The tower instructed them to climb to 4,000 feet and proceed directly toward St. Thomas. At 15:31, the flight was handed over to San Juan Center, which advised that a higher altitude would soon be assigned. Meanwhile, the pilots noticed that their fuel gauges were fluctuating wildly, showing anywhere from 850 to just over 2,000 pounds. The erratic readings may have been caused by condensation on the probes and sloshing fuel in nearly empty tanks, but the captain felt confident. There had to be at least 2,000 pounds left, a figure later confirmed by investigation. Still, even that would only be enough if they climbed efficiently. Moments later, San Juan asked what altitude they preferred. The captain replied, as high as possible. They were cleared to 12,000 feet, and he began the climb. But strangely, instead of using maximum thrust to get up quickly, saving fuel in the long run, he pulled back power, likely believing he was conserving. In reality, this only prolonged the climb and wasted more fuel. The crew had every right, and every reason, to declare a fuel emergency at this point. In fact, they technically should have done so even earlier, as soon as they realized reserves would be compromised. But at that time, the guidelines for declaring fuel emergencies weren't as standardized as they are today, leaving the decision up to the captain's judgment. As the climb continued, the first officer asked for their distance to St. Thomas. San Juan replied, 92 miles southeast. The captain quickly realized that St. Croix lay closer and asked controllers for that distance instead. The reply came back, 70 miles northeast, with weather reported as overcast at 2,000 feet, but visibility a clear 15 miles. The captain immediately changed his plan, deciding to aim for St. Croix instead. He asked the first officer to pull out the approach charts, but they had been misplaced in the binder of jeppies and plates. The first officer, overwhelmed by stress and in what we would now call a form of subtle incapacitation, froze. His ability to function deteriorated to the point where the captain had to repeat instructions multiple times just to get minimal responses. Soon, the captain was essentially running the entire show, flying the airplane, handling radio calls, and trying to formulate a plan. Today's crew resource management training exists to prevent exactly this kind of breakdown. But back then, it hadn't yet been widely implemented, and by the time the workload imbalance became clear, it no longer mattered. The captain's inefficient climb had already burned so much fuel that neither St. Thomas nor St. Croix was realistically within reach anymore. The only remaining option was St. Martin, the very airport where they had just failed to land 3 separate times. As they passed through 7,000 feet, the fuel gauges suddenly dropped to just 550 pounds. Almost immediately, low fuel pressure lights illuminated, warning that the engines were on the brink of flaming out from starvation. In that moment, the grim reality set in. Unless a miracle occurred, they were going to lose power over the Caribbean Sea. The captain summoned the purser to the cockpit and informed him that they were very low on fuel and might need to ditch the aircraft. His phrasing using might led the purser to think it was only a precaution, not an imminent likelihood. Assuming there would be further warning if things got critical, he relayed the news to the passengers as a possible precautionary ditching, not an urgent one. Modern CRM places heavy emphasis on clear communication between cockpit and cabin to avoid exactly this type of misunderstanding. In this case, the wording caused serious consequences. Passengers were told to prepare for ditching, but without knowing how much time they had. The purser correctly prioritized the most critical step, getting life vests distributed, but problems quickly surfaced. Some passengers struggled to remove the vests from their pouches under the seats. Others couldn't tear open the plastic, or became confused about the straps. To complicate matters, 2 different models of life vests were on board, each with slightly different instructions. On top of that, many travelers believed ditching was unlikely, so they ignored the preparations. A few even wandered around the cabin, snapping photos instead of getting ready. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the navigator, the purser tried to reposition the forward life raft, but its sheer weight made it impossible to handle alone. Even with assistance from another crew member, they still needed a passenger's help to finally wrestle it out of its storage compartment. Up front in the cockpit, the captain now faced one of the most critical, tactical choices of his career. Ditching an airliner on open water requires precision. The safest technique is to align the aircraft parallel with the ocean swells, rather than cutting across them, because striking a wave head-on could tear the airplane apart. The touchdown itself must also be made with the lowest possible forward speed and minimal vertical descent to reduce structural forces on impact. The dilemma was this: climbing as high as possible before fuel exhaustion might give them more glide range toward land, but it also meant that once the engines quit, they would have to descend blindly through thick cloud layers. Emerging only seconds before impact, the crew would have almost no time to identify the direction of the waves, align with them, configure the airplane, and reduce speed. To the captain, such a scenario seemed nearly impossible. Instead, he decided to abandon the climb immediately and begin descending toward the ocean. Staying lower would at least give him more time to observe the sea conditions, set up the approach, and slow the airplane while the engines were still producing some thrust. This decision was consistent with modern ditching guidance, which assumes having power available during the approach is essential. At 15:38, the captain requested and received clearance from San Juan to descend. He also contacted St. Martin Tower for an updated weather report, but the news was worse than before. Visibility had fallen to just 2 or 3 miles, with deteriorating conditions. That effectively removed St. Martin as an option. The captain informed San Juan that they were descending toward the water and might have to ditch at sea. The supervisor at San Juan Center immediately escalated the emergency, alerting the Coast Guard, which began dispatching ships and helicopters toward the area. Controllers suggested once more that the crew try to return to St. Martin, but given the poor weather and the aircraft's dwindling fuel, the captain refused. Only minutes of fuel remained when Flight 980 finally broke out beneath the overcast at just 500 feet above the ocean. What the crew saw was sobering. The sea was dark, violent, and filled with chaotic waves crashing in multiple directions. This was nothing like the calm postcard blue Caribbean tourists imagine. No airliner had ever attempted a ditching in conditions like this. The captain began a methodical descent, stepping down in 100-foot intervals to judge his height more accurately and to bleed off speed. At each pause, he extended another stage of flaps, aiming to reach full flap before impact. Full flaps would allow the slowest possible safe flying speed, giving them the best chance to survive. He also closed the rear outflow valve to limit water ingress, part of the ditching checklist. But with time running out, the crew couldn't complete much more of it. The navigator briefly left the cockpit but returned, worried about how little fuel remained. He asked the captain for warning before impact. The captain promised to call it out a few seconds in advance. The first officer shut down the air conditioning packs as part of the procedure. Then, with the flaps set fully, the captain slowed the DC-9 from 140 knots down to just 90, barely above stall speed. At 15 hours, 47 minutes and 40 seconds, he transmitted to San Juan. 980, Roger, we're ditching. It was their final radio call. Seconds later, the radar track vanished as the airplane descended through 20 feet. To keep essential instruments alive after the engines failed, the captain switched the emergency power on. Realizing the PA system was inoperative, he tried to warn the cabin by flicking the seatbelt sign 3 times in quick succession, believing it would serve as an improvised emergency signal. Unfortunately, the ALM flight attendants had never been briefed on such a code, and no passengers reported noticing it. Worse, if he activated the sign after switching to emergency power, the lights might not have worked at all. As a result, no one in the cabin realized impact was seconds away. Then, one by one, both engines finally flamed out. The captain shouted through the open cockpit door for the navigator to get ready. That single yell became the only clear warning to the cabin. The navigator urgently called for the purser and steward to strap in, but they had no time. The steward couldn't even reach his seat and instead braced himself on top of the uninflated life raft in the galley. Farther back, a passenger screamed that they were about to crash, spurring a flight attendant to dash through the aisle, pushing people down into their seats. Tragically, she made it only a few rows before impact. At the controls, the captain aimed for the backside of a swell to soften the blow and ordered the first officer to brace. Moments later, the DC-9 slammed into the ocean with a force estimated between 8 and 12 Gs. The deceleration was so violent that the jet stopped in less than its own length. For a moment, the crew found themselves underwater at a steep nose-down angle, the aircraft banking heavily to the left. Incredibly, the captain managed to level the wings, exploiting the fact that control surfaces respond to both air and water as fluids. This allowed the cockpit to break the surface, and the fuselage began bobbing damaged, but largely intact. Inside the cabin, however, the toll was already devastating. Several people were still standing when the plane hit the ocean, including flight attendant Margaret Abraham, who is believed to have been fatally thrown forward while heroically trying to protect her passengers. Those upright at the moment of impact likely died instantly. Even passengers who were seated faced grave dangers. Some suffered serious or fatal injuries when their seats tore loose from the floor and were hurled ahead with great force. Investigators later determined that 7 passengers were ejected because of outdated seatbelt designs on the DC-9. These older buckles, made with fabric straps gripping against metal claws, sometimes failed under extreme force, releasing unexpectedly. The precise number of lives lost in the initial crash could never be firmly established, but for those who did survive, the nightmare was just beginning. The aircraft was floating 35 miles from the nearest land, while rescue was still more than an hour and a half away. Almost immediately, water began flooding into the fuselage through ruptures and openings, and the jet started sinking. The remaining crew and the navigator rushed to launch a life raft, but the forward galley where it was stored was quickly overwhelmed by water, loose equipment, and even injured passengers. In the chaos, someone accidentally pulled the inflation cord, and the raft expanded inside the galley itself, blocking access between the cockpit and passenger cabin. At the rear, a passenger succeeded in opening the right overwing exit, allowing people to get out. But the waves crashed violently over the wing, leaving escapees no choice but to jump into the sea. The captain, trapped by the raft's bulk inside the galley area, climbed out through his side cockpit window, swam to the left wing, and managed to force open another exit from the outside, helping more passengers evacuate. Meanwhile, at the forward door, the inflating raft shoved the navigator straight out of the plane and into the ocean. Nearby, he spotted an unopened emergency slide pack floating in the waves. He inflated it, and survivors began swimming toward it, clinging to it as a makeshift raft. The first officer, initially pinned by the inflated raft inside the cabin, eventually escaped and jumped into the sea. Realizing he had forgotten his life vest, he climbed atop the inflated slide and began organizing survivors who gathered there. By the time the last passenger got out, the jet was rapidly going under. Water swallowed the exits, and within moments, the DC-9 slipped nose-first beneath the waves, never to resurface. Survivors now found themselves adrift in stormy seas, surrounded by wreckage, oil slicks, and debris, tossed helplessly in 3 to 4 meter swells beneath heavy rain and an overcast sky. Through the storm, salvation suddenly appeared, not a ship, but a Pan Am Boeing 727 that had been diverted to search for the missing plane. Its crew spotted the survivors and radioed their position to rescue authorities. Soon, a U.S. Coast Guard seaplane and a small aircraft from a local flight school arrived, dropping life rafts. Unfortunately, the rafts blew too far away in the gale to be reached. The captain and navigator swam desperately toward the dropped rafts, but they couldn't fight the wind and current to bring them back to the group. Survivors had to endure the waves for more than 90 minutes before help finally came in the form of a U.S. Navy Sea King helicopter. Despite not carrying professional rescue swimmers, its crew managed to lift 26 people from the water. A Coast Guard helicopter also arrived, pulling for people to safety before its hoist cable broke. The crew attempted to pull others directly onto the helicopter's skids, but were eventually forced to retreat as conditions worsened. Another Coast Guard helicopter arrived soon after, lifting 7 more survivors. As darkness closed in, 3 people including the first officer remained, clinging to the escape slide. At last, 2 U.S. Marine helicopters reached the scene. One carried away a deceased passenger, while the other rescued the final 3 survivors. barely making it back to San Juan with only minutes of fuel left. In total, 40 people survived, but 23 lives were lost, including 22 passengers and flight attendant Margaret Abraham, who was posthumously honored by the Dutch government for her bravery. Only one victim's body was ever recovered. The others likely went down with the wreckage, resting more than 5,000 feet beneath the ocean surface. The NTSB chose not to recover the flight recorders, instead reconstructing events from survivor testimony and other evidence. Investigators concluded the crash resulted from repeated unsuccessful landing attempts at SNT Martin until little fuel remained to safely reach an alternate airport. Poorly reported weather at the destination was noted as a contributing factor, and the lack of clear communication between cockpit and cabin crews likely reduced survivability. As a result, new safety regulations were introduced. Airliners could no longer depart with an inoperative public address system unless a backup method was in place. And outdated fabric-to-metal seatbelt buckles were phased out in favor of modern all-metal designs. While the captain was commended for his handling of the ditching itself, his decision-making before that point was deemed overly optimistic and ultimately catastrophic. He never flew again after losing his license, passing away in 2024. The story of Flight 980 remains a stark reminder. Fuel management and cautious judgment are essential, and crews must always prepare for the worst-case scenario, not just the hope for outcome.